Hi everybody, my name is Mina Jane and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library, where you are sitting right now. And I'm really pleased to be bringing you this program with this panel, which is going to be amazing and interesting and maybe a little heart-wrenching. This is Jen Wuelfing, our town social worker. She's going to be leading our panel and moderating the Q&A. So if she's going to get started with introductions, and I just wanted to say that anything on the tables you're welcome to take. As I told somebody, as long as it doesn't have a barcode on it, you can have it and keep it forever. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. I know it's could be kind of difficult, but it also is an important conversation. So welcome to the library. I hope to see you again here soon for other amazing events.
Except the books have a barcode, but you can take those as well.
Oh, those are the store barcodes. If they have a library barcode, I will find you. All right, so welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Good evening. Welcome to the Ashland Public Library for this event in honor of Women's History Month. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, I will be facilitating a panel discussion centering around trauma and social justice using the movie Promising Young Woman as a platform. The panel discussion is being recorded by WACA, our local cable station. However, we will not be recording the follow-up Q&A portion of the evening when we open up the event for a larger community conversation. The movie Promising Young Woman is an incredibly powerful film that, although the script itself is fiction, the events that occur and the themes the movie highlights are rampant in our society, and they are too often dismissed and ignored. Some of the topics we will be discussing here tonight include sexual assault, consent, misogyny, suicidality, internalized sexism, substance use, accountability, and privilege. If at any point you need to step away from the room and take some space, we encourage you to do that. We do have professional supports here tonight if you need to speak with someone privately. We have Michelle and April if they want to raise their hands in case you need to talk to either of them. If there's anyone that needs to check in with Michelle or April and take a break, you're welcome to do that. If we look at the experience of sexual-related trauma or misconduct as a spectrum that ranges from receiving unwanted sexual comments to sex slavery, it's fair to wonder if close to 100% of women fall somewhere on that spectrum. We are here today to provide a safe space and to mitigate the silence that surrounds sexual trauma. Silence about trauma breeds shame. Shame thrives when it's alone, and it creates a lens in which we see ourselves. As women and as a society, we're not going to be okay until we can give a voice to that shame and talk about what hurts. We also want to acknowledge the heteronormative themes of this movie and subsequently this discussion. We would like to say up front that although we are framing this discussion through a lens of privilege and traditional gender norms, we are doing so in response to the movie we are using as a platform for this discussion. However, all of these themes occur at a higher frequency and on a larger, more complex scale for those who are differently abled, individuals in the LGBTQ+ community, as well as people of color. Before I provide a brief description of the movie, I'd like to welcome our incredibly impressive and wise panel and allow them to briefly introduce themselves by sharing their name, their pronouns, their occupation, and or employer. Let's start with Elizabeth.
I sat over here so I wouldn't have to go first or anything, but my name is Elizabeth. My pronouns are she, her. I'm here today from Minding Your Mind, which is a mental health organization you'll hear a little bit more about. My role there is as a mental health speaker. And was there anything else we're supposed to?
That's it.
Wonderful.
And Jordan.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Jordan Burnham. I am the Director of Training at Minding Your Mind. And at Minding Your Mind, we have incredible speakers who go around and share their stories and speak on the subject of mental health. I have the fortunate job and opportunity to train those speakers and to work with them so that I'm not telling them how to tell their story, but taking their story and helping it become a mental health presentation for all ages for people to hear.
Thank you.
I'm going to go now. Hi, I'm Caitlin. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Director of New England at Minding Your Mind, where I get to work with these amazing people, and I'm really excited to be here.
And
Hi everyone, I'm Amanda. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the Outreach and Prevention Specialist at Voices Against Violence, which is a dual domestic and sexual violence agency.
Lisa McDonald, she, hers. I am the Director for Equity Compliance at Mass Bay Community College. So locally here, where I serve as the Title IX coordinator. So I do training and education around harassment, discrimination, and sex-based misconduct, as well as the investigation should anyone allege any type of harassment, discrimination, or sexual misconduct.
And my name is Jennifer Wuelfing. I'm the Director of the Human Services Department and one of the social workers for the town of Ashland. Before we begin the panel discussion, I'll give a very brief description of the movie. I hope you all had the opportunity to watch. And I want to thank the Friends of the Library for their generosity in purchasing the movie rights from Swank Movie Productions, giving viewing access to residents who otherwise wouldn't have been able to watch the film we're going to discuss tonight. Released in December of 2020, Promising Young Woman stars Carey Mulligan, who plays Cassie, the childhood friend of Nina. The viewer is informed through exposition that Nina was sexually assaulted at a party by a classmate while she was in medical school. She later drops out of school and dies by suicide. Cassie also dropped out of medical school following Nina's assault to take care of her. She spends much of her time and energy following the passing of her friend, attempting to avenge both the assault and her death. In the beginning of the movie, we see Cassie doing this by going to bars and pretending to be intoxicated in order to entice predatory men to take her back to their place, knowing they intend to take advantage of her, and instead she reveals she is sober. As the movie progresses, Cassie begins to set a series of traps in an attempt to seek emotional retribution from those responsible and complicit for what happened to Nina. In the end, Cassie is murdered by Nina's rapist, and he is arrested at his wedding for her murder. Let's begin the discussion. This question is for everybody. What made you want to be part of this conversation?
You invited me. So no, I could just briefly say that, any opportunity, and I mean that when I say that, Jen reached out and said, we're gonna have this discussion, and any opportunity that I think we can get as members of a community to come together and to talk about these issues that so often don't get talked about. I was excited also to talk about the film because I don't know a lot of people that actually have seen it. So to even just process with some of the people here, the film was very therapeutic for me.
Hi there. I think for me, having this conversation is really crucial to talk about sexual violence, having folks learn about it, and then in turn preventing it. I actually had never seen the film prior to being part of this panel, so having that lens and that insight based off of the film was really, really important for me.
Is this one on? Yeah. So Jennifer called me and was like, I hear Minding Your Mind has amazing speakers. I'm thinking about doing this event, Promising Young Woman. Have you seen the movie? And I was like, oh yeah, I have. I have seen the movie, and let's talk about it. I could talk about it for hours. Because, I don't know, this movie encompasses so many themes that I care so much about, right? Mental health, trauma, women's rights, the list just goes on and on and on. So I'm really excited for us to get into it.
Yeah, for me, when I took this role as Director of Training at Minding Your Mind, I knew I would be working with women and them sharing their stories. And I knew it would be naive of me to think that sexual assault wouldn't be a part of some of those discussions. So when I took my role, I decided I wanted to read as much as possible and educate myself as much as possible. But I could read as many books as I want. Until I have real conversations with the women in my life, I'm not going to truly understand. And so from Caitlin and I having these conversations so much leading up to Promising Young Woman coming out, when she texted me and said, hey, you have to watch this, I knew that meant, A, I have to watch this, and B, get ready for hours of talking afterwards. And so I'm in the same boat of I don't know a ton of people who had seen this movie, and so I'm always passionate about not just the speaking out part, but just more so the listening. And I appreciate being invited in the space to do that.
Sorry. So when Caitlin talked to Jordan, Jordan then called me and said, watch this, and we've had multiple hour conversations about this. It's a really important film and I want to be a part of this conversation. For me, there's a couple reasons for that. I think the first is sort of what Caitlin said, this has a lot of really important themes. And I think it's a conversation that deserves to be had widely and a conversation that deserves to be nuanced. I also think it's important, for me at least, I'm queer and I think that these conversations tend to happen oftentimes in the context of films like this, where it is a very heteronormative context. And I think that, I hope that my role on this panel, and the role of possibly other people here, is to kind of add some texture to the conversation as well, because sexual assault doesn't just happen in the context of heteronormative relationships. So.
I have to say, when I first called Caitlin, and it was a kind of a tentative idea that I had been talking about for over a year after I'd seen this movie, and her enthusiasm really was like, oh wait, we could actually do this. So I really appreciate that was the first conversation. Well, the second, first being with Kristen and having the idea blossom from there. What do you think is the significance of the title of the movie, Promising Young Woman? Anybody?
Talk a little bit about it. So in my work, I shared with you, I serve as an investigator, should anybody allege sexual misconduct, sexual assault, and where I currently work, and I've done this at other institutions as well. And what I will say is that oftentimes, especially particularly in the case where men are the accused, there are so many people that will say to me, but this person, their life, they have so much promise and so much is happening to them, and now we're going to go ruin their life. And it's about very much men being promising young men, and this incident being accused and then going forward being reported is going to somehow shatter that, and they're no longer that promising young person. And I think this movie, for so many ways, completely smashes the patriarchy, right? And so with that, I think that it was brilliant to call it Promising Young Woman, because we don't often think about that. It's like, well, this person's life can be ruined. Well, the victim, their life is completely changed now. So how can we not have it from that lens as well? So I thought that that's how the title spoke to me when I often heard the term. Such a promising future for this person.
Jordan or Elizabeth? I guess when I heard the title for the first time, it made me think of, a couple things. The first was, and I'm sure many other people thought of this too, as Brock Turner. In that case, I think we heard so much in the media, this promising young man. We heard all about his athletic career. We saw what appeared to be a great show of emotion, appeared to be genuine remorse. And usually when I hear the phrase promising young woman, it's about a woman who's died. She was such a promising young woman, and it's about the fact that she won't get to live out her promise. So for me, it spoke to these two things. There's also a discussion that I wrote down a couple quotes from that happened within the movie. When Cassie goes to talk to Dean Walker about, what happened with Nina, the sexual assault of Nina. And Dean Walker says, well, what would you have me do? Ruin a young man's life every time we get an accusation like this? And I circled every time, because in the previous sentence she says, we get 1 or 2 of these a week. This conversation was really raw for me, because I had nearly an identical conversation with the dean at the college where I was sexually assaulted. And it was almost an identical reception I got from a dean. And to me, in the role of a victim survivor in that situation, it felt like my promise wasn't being considered, right? We were considering the promise of the young men who sexually assaulted me, but I wasn't, framed as a promising young woman, but rather a woman who could ruin a young man's promise. So that was really, significant for me. And I think one other thing, I guess, that I'll say about that conversation, between Dean Walker and Cassie says, so you're happy to just take the boy's word for it. And the dean says, yeah, well, innocent until proven guilty. And for me, that directly harkens back to Trump's words in 2018 relating to Brett Kavanaugh when he says, it's a scary time in America for young men because they were guilty until proven innocent. And this just gave me a lot to reflect on because we know that rates of false reporting are actually incredibly low, between 2 and 10%. False reports of rape or sexual assault. And so oftentimes, that innocent until proven guilty is something that I think that comes up a lot. But we just assume that they're innocent and we don't take the time to prove guilt or innocence. Yes, lots of thoughts on this entire movie, so I'm really gonna try to stick with the notes I wrote myself. Also, embarrassingly enough, they're on the back of scratch paper for kids I work with, so I'm gonna try also to keep them low in my lap. But yeah, again, so many thoughts, but this is what I'm gonna try to focus on what I notated for myself.
The director of Promising Young Woman, Emerald Fennell, said, quote, "It's never complicated when it's a horrible monster. It's complicated when it's your friend, your crush. It's somebody that is self-identifying, somebody that is a self-identifying good person. That's what the film is about." What does she mean by this?
Hi, this quote's really interesting because I think as a society, we often perpetuate this idea that sexual assault happens in this dark alley, some stranger hiding behind a bush. And this is a narrative that we perpetuated again as a society, and it's kind of something that we hold as the only reality that happens, when the actual reality is sexual violence happens among people that the survivor knows. It's actually approximately 80% of sexual assaults happen from either an acquaintance or someone that they know. So it's really interesting when we have this, false sense of how this happens, and then actually the way it happens really just is totally different. I think it becomes really complicated when we have those two narratives battling each other, and really puts survivors, at risk in terms of whether they're feeling believed, whether they want to report and choosing to report. It creates a lot of those barriers.
So it reminds me of an instance one time where at a previous institution of where I worked, we were sharing data about the number of sexual assaults that had occurred on campus at a given amount of time, right? Reports. And somebody raised their hand. I don't remember who, but I'll never forget the statement. It said, "Have you caught the guy? Have you caught," right? As if it's this one person, just to what your point is, as if they're in the bushes hiding and waiting, right? It's one person. It's well, we know who they are. It's our students, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's best friend, someone's roommate. And I think that, right, because when we can put distance to it, right, and it's happening over there, and it's that dark space, and if we catch the person, it will go away. It breeds a lot of discomfort. It's a scary thing to think about, but it's even scarier and more complicated when we're close to it, and we know the people, and we know the parties involved. So, have you caught the guy? I remember that really well.
What role does alcohol play in the movie or in our society in terms of accountability, blame, and a mechanism to create the illusion of safety? What is consent? When is someone unable to give consent?
So I'll speak to that first part about alcohol and the way that it's used in the movie. Because it's used as a vehicle to, I think, show a few different parts of our society that have become normalized in a certain way. So the first is in that first scene when Cassie appears to be drunk. The three guys that are looking at her say she should know better than to get drunk and to be in this place around men. She should know better at her age. As if that's something at her age she should know by now, that she's probably had some experiences, so she knows she shouldn't do that, but they didn't finish that part of the conversation. So there is that instance. Then the illusion of safety, where in two instances, one of the men who's talking to Cassie says, let's go up for a drink or two. Let's go up for a beer. Neither one of them have that intention. It's not just going up to have a drink, because they would never say, I'm just going up to get you drunk so I can take advantage of you. They would never say that. But if you say just one or two drinks, it gives you that illusion of safety of like, oh, okay, well, this is good intentions here. That's okay. Plus, in terms of accountability, there's one scene where it's so hard not to call him McLovin. It's like, there's a few scenes actually. So one of them with the actor in this role where he's basically saying, once he's caught, that he's trying to take advantage of Cassie, he says, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm really high. And he uses that as a way to get out of what is going on. So it's to place blame on her when she's drinking, she's drunk, she should know better. But I was drunk. He doesn't remember. It was a party. They were drinking. They were young. And so there's blame that's used in one party. And then in the other, it's to use it to get rid of that accountability and to excuse it in any way. And so in this film, it was really interesting to see how alcohol was used as a vehicle for that in a few different situations.
Yeah, just to also speak on the topic of alcohol in the film and in these sorts of situations in real life. I am a recovering alcoholic. I'm in recovery. And this film, for so many reasons, hit home for me. But I really recognized and identified with Cassie, or the person Cassie pretended to be. That first scene, I actually texted Caitlin just 5 minutes into the movie. I'm like, wow, this is a lot. Because I really deeply felt that. There have been so many times in my active addiction or active alcoholism where I was that person that Cassie pretended to be. And I know that in a number of cases, even now, it's hard for me to say this was sexual assault. Because even though I rationally know that I was doing something I wouldn't have done sober with someone I didn't want to do with, I was able to rationalize, I probably can't consider this sexual assault. I was drunk. I only said no once. I put myself in a compromising situation. I know better. And that says a lot, I think, because I have a lot of experience with mental health. I've done a lot of sexual assault advocacy, and I still hesitated to call these times during my alcoholism sexual assault, and that's a problem, I think. I did learn, though, in the first few days of college, several weeks before I was raped, that women could avoid being sexually victimized by being smart. I learned, not to drink too much, not to walk alone, buddy up, all of that stuff. And I heard this in the context of an orientation seminar that was split up in along a gender binary, because obviously only men and women exist. That was sarcasm. I think the gender exists on a wide spectrum. But yes, this seminar was divided into a seminar for the boys and a seminar for the girls. I don't know what the boys heard, but they were in and out in under 20 minutes. Our seminar was over an hour. And most of it focused on how not to get raped. One boy that I was friends with explained to me after that one thing they had learned was that consent can't be given from someone who is incapacitated by alcohol, so that boys should be aware of that because girls could try to use that against them to substantiate claims of sexual assault. That is kind of exactly how we see, alcohol framed and considered in the film as well. For me, I guess I can sort of think about it as alcohol is something that can get girls into trouble. Like you heard from Jordan, the time where at the beginning, that early scene, the boys say, oh, they put themselves in danger, girls like that. So it's something that can get girls into trouble and it can get boys out of trouble. When Al says, I didn't do anything, yeah, we were all drunk. She was into it. And I think that for me is like that one sentence that I can really hold on to is that alcohol is something we can use and manipulate. It doesn't apply in the same way to all people. And again, I know when I say boys and girls, I am speaking in a more binary way, and that's not how the world works. But certainly in this movie, that's that's the role that alcohol plays for me.
I think just so much of what you were saying, Elizabeth, just really resonates. And I think one of the most important things that I can say right now is that sexual assault happens despite of alcohol use, not because of it. And I think again about, the Brock Turner case, and specifically Chanel Miller. She wrote a book called Know My Name. It's a really great memoir if anyone wants to read it. But in that book, she talks about how, her, being drunk was it was weaponized in the courtroom, whereas, Brock Turner being drunk was used as an excuse. And she talks about how, even if she had stayed home, even if she was sober, he would have just done it to someone else. So I think it's really crucial to mention how, this stuff is sexual assault is premeditated. It's planned out, and that needs to be named. And also just to talk about consent as well. I think, part of my role, I go into organizations and schools, and I talk about consent with students and other folks. And at Voices, we use a little acronym from Planned Parenthood. Many might have heard of it, but it's called FRIES. It's great. Just to break it down, FRIES in terms of consent, the F is freely given, the I is informed, the E is enthusiastic, the S is specific. Yes. Thank you so much, Becca. And I think that's a really great way to use consent. And if any of those things aren't existing when you're becoming intimate with someone, that needs to be taken into account. And again, someone cannot consent if they are incapacitated.
In what ways do some of the women in the film avoid accountability or uphold patriarchy? How might we be upholding patriarchy without realizing it?
So the part that I think about the most is obviously, where I see myself, and I'm horrified in that way. I'll be honest with all of you, is through the dean, right? The scene with the dean, because that is me. That is my role. I'm an administrator on a college campus, and I sit there behind a big desk, and someone comes in and they say what's happened to them, just like you did, Elizabeth. And I'm so sorry, because that is not how it should look like at all. And to hear these stories is just heartbreaking, because when something like that happens, you lose control, right? And I have to remind myself of that, because when somebody is sitting across from me telling me their story, I want to give them some type of control back. So here are your options. This is what you can do. Here are your supports. Where a lot of people in my work really screw up is when they are thinking about the end of it and how somebody is going to be found responsible or not responsible, when you haven't even given someone a chance to tell their story, right? And you deserve to tell your story. And so I think that's for me in the place, right? I mean, even the scene itself, she's sitting behind the big table and with all the books and the Ivy Tower, and that for me, I said, okay, well, there's the patriarchy, right? And I thought it was interesting. I love that it was Connie Britton, right? Connie Britton, that's her name, the actress, playing the dean, because what we see oftentimes is men in that role, right? I think of, and I'm sorry, I can only think of comedies like the Dean Wormers, right? Kind of, sitting there, but to sit there across, seeing a woman in that role and saying, basically, upholding the patriarchy like that. How we do it in society is by continuously perpetuating the I don't believe you. And I think that the more we can just say, I believe you, and people say, well, what if the case doesn't go to court? What if they didn't report it to the police? It doesn't matter. That's all part of it, right? That's on the side. The story itself, I believe you. And I think that that's one of the most important things that we can do. Because as you said before, right, the number is so small of knowingly falsified reports. It's between 2 and 8%. When I give presentations, I say, how many percentage do you think are knowingly falsified reports? I've gotten as low as 0, and I've gotten high as 75. Okay? So there is those preconceived notions out there. that people lie and then knowingly falsify reports. And we know that is not the case. And so I think, again, whatever we can do to say, whatever's happened, whatever you think has clouded this, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means something else, right? Just believe people when they tell you their stories. And I believe you.
In what ways does privilege, oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
No, go ahead.
I just want to talk about the latter part of that. In what ways do we uphold patriarchy just like in our society? Because I think it happens in a lot of really tiny, invisible ways. Right through these like internalized beliefs that we don't even know we have. That we've learned, right, like a million times and has been just invisible. I'll give you an example. I can remember the first time I learned this lesson, and I've learned it so many times since. I was 5 years old, I was in kindergarten. I was always like a really weird artsy kid, I still kind of am. But I was running onto the playground and I was holding this like big box of crayons that I was really excited about and some paper, and I ran to the cement area, and this boy came up behind me and pushed me to the ground, and my crayons go everywhere. It's like broken, and I'm crying, right? And I'm so upset that this happened to me, and I went up to my teacher and I told her what happened, and I will never forget the look on her face. She smiled and she leaned in like she was telling me this secret, and she said, "That means he likes you." Right? Raise your hand if you've heard that. Right? But this was the first time in my life I remember that I learned that sometimes affection looks like anger. Sometimes love looks like violence. And if I go to tell somebody that this happened to me, they won't care. They won't do anything about it. Right? And as a 5-year-old, right, I can't put that together. I can't go, at some point I may have to report a sexual assault and I need to look back on this and not internalize this belief about love, myself, and all of it, right? So I think about that as like so many things we've just ingrained as normal, right? What did that boy learn from that situation, from pushing me down on the ground and having nothing happened? That boy learned that when I have big feelings, it's okay for me to express it through anger. It's okay for me to express it through violence. And if I do it to a girl, nobody's going to do anything, right? So when we get to the point where we're like, how could this kid ever do that? He must be a monster. He must be a bad kid, right? It'd be super easy for me to be like, that kid's a bad kid, and I'm gonna stay away from him, right? Or like, that teacher was a bad teacher, right? But they aren't the people that, they're not alone in it, right? It's bigger than that. It's the patriarchy, right? That's the big monster. And so I think when I think about ways that we uphold it, like we do it all the time in tiny ways. Like I do it when I watch the news and I see a woman in a pencil skirt and stilettos and I say, I would never wear that. Right? And in those 3 seconds that I think that, which like may come from like a feminist thing where I'm like, she should wear what she wants to wear, right? But when I do that for those 3 seconds, I stop listening to her, right? I'm upholding patriarchy in that moment and I don't even mean to do it. So I think that's just like something that just doesn't get said enough, right? That like it's in us. We've eaten it. Like we're breathing it. And it's there all the time.
Thank you for sharing. In what ways does privilege come up in this film, or within the themes we've mentioned?
Yeah, I thought with privilege, there are a few things I think that stood out to me the first time I watched the film. And one of them was this scene where Cassie, who is incredibly angry, incredibly frustrated. She's in the car, and there's a man to the left of her he's beeping behind her, is angry, goes over to the left, right next to her and still continues to yell at her. And for whatever reason, he's still asking, what are you doing? When she gets out of the car with a crowbar and like walking towards his car. It's like, what are you? And it's almost like he's not expecting a woman would ever take that action to his car to actually get out and do that. But she does. And she hits the car and she slams it and he just calls her. I mean, there's a lot of words she gets called, but then he just drives away. And as a Black man sitting there, I couldn't help but think, if that's a Black woman, what is the reaction? Because he calls Cassie crazy when she does that. But if it's a Black woman, she's threatening. And then the police are getting called. And there are parts of privilege just like that and little scenes like that that I think the first time really stood out to me. Of course, male privilege is just throughout this entire film. But another one that stood out to me the most, I thought it was a really interesting choice for doctors, for Bo Burnham, for like the characters in here to be doctors. Because there is this instance when there's a detective who's coming to talk to Ryan, played by Bo Burnham. We're not related, by the way. I forgot to say. I'm sorry. I didn't answer your email about that. I'm terribly sorry.
I was wondering.
But the detective or officer comes into Bo Burnham's office, who's he's a doctor. Children. He saves lives. Children's lives. And he's so apologetic for even wasting his time. Like, yes, this woman is missing. I'm sure something's going on, but I'm sure you're not the one who has anything to do with it. So if you achieve a certain place within our society, we're going to just overlook some things. Like, you can never do that. You're at a high position. You're a doctor. You save lives. There's no way you could ever be a part of this. And there's something about when someone is complicit, obviously there's various different reasons for that. And some of that, of course, is unconscious, but in that instance, looking around a doctor's office, talking to a doctor, that detective is thinking, well, he wouldn't have done this. He's successful. Look at those degrees. Went to school. He does surgery. There's no way he could be a part of this. And there is this privilege that comes along with being at a certain place within our society, especially a white man being in our society. And at the very end, even when Al, the character Al, gets taken away by the police, as a Black man, I didn't say, oh, good, the movie's done. Because I've just seen that too many times. Someone gets arrested, goes to jail, white male, a lot of money. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, they're out in 2 or 3 months? That doesn't sound, wait, they just got away with it? How do they have them? And there's a privilege that, in my mind, when I saw him got taken away by the police, I thought, that means nothing. I don't trust that the authorities are going to go through with what they're supposed to. I know that there's going to be some evidence that goes missing. I know that there's enough money to go into that courtroom that Al's going to be in there, and with good behavior, probably be out in maybe a few years, if that. And that's, to me, some of the privilege that came through immediately as soon as I started watching this movie.
I think that, yeah, there's so many examples, like you said, in small ways. I think when I think of privilege, something that I want to speak to in this movie is that, kind of as I mentioned at the beginning, not to beat a dead horse or anything, but all of the romantic relationships in this film are between someone who presents as a cis man and someone who presents as a cis woman. So they're all heteronormative, hetero-presenting relationships. And there's a lot to be said for seeing yourself reflected in media. I think this can be applied to race, to gender, sexuality. But I think that when we exclusively focus on narratives that center a heteronormative perspective, and we don't see narratives that talk about violence existing in the queer community or to queer people, we run the risk of, having a queer person walk away from that saying, well, it doesn't happen to people like me, right? Or it doesn't happen in my community. And I think that's a huge disservice. I was so enthused to see Laverne Cox cast. She's an awesome trans woman of color, and she's both a talented actress and a really strong advocate for trans people and trans people of color. And so I was so hoping that there would be some sort of like maybe storyline in there where trans rights or trans stories were discussed, and there wasn't, which I thought was a bummer. But I mean, not a bummer, because it's like, if we are talking about violence against trans people, that sucks. But, I thought that was a missed opportunity with someone who's very, very talented. Really quickly, just again, I don't want to make this like my whole platform, but trans people are so much more likely than cis people to experience rape, to be raped or sexually assaulted. And around half of all trans people are raped at some point in their lifetime. That is staggering. That 1 in 2, right? Half of all people who identify as trans, that's way too many people. 1 is too many people, but that to me is really, that's huge. I think, another group of people who experiences rates of violence at really high levels are bisexual women, bisexual men, people who identify as bi or pan or on that spectrum. Their rates of rape and sexual assault, they are experienced at much higher levels. So I think, for me, I was disappointed that the film didn't have more nuance when it came to sexuality. I understand, that it's just one film and that wasn't the focus of the movie. But I guess I bring this up because there is a privilege in seeing your narrative reflected on screen. And so I think that was, that kind of came up for me when I saw the film.
How does this film or romantic comedies in general uphold rigid gender norms?
Sure. I'm gonna, put myself on the line here when I explain this scene, but the beginning of the film, Ryan, who's played by Burnham, am I getting that name? Okay. He comes into the coffee shop and, not me forgetting the main character's name. Cassie. Cassie. Thank you so much. He comes into the coffee shop and recognizes Cassie from medical school, and he asks Cassie on a date. She declines. She spits in his coffee. He finds it very romantic, I guess, and walks out. She also gives him a fake number when he asks for it, and you would think, you get the hint that this person is not interested. But he comes back, and he's like, you gave me a fake number, and I still really want to go on a date with you. And then she says again, I'm really just not looking for a relationship. And he says something like, how about a friendship where I'm pining for you the whole time? And the way that you see the scene, it's played off in a really funny romantic way, and I didn't even catch it. I watched it a second time, and that's when I caught it. Because when I first watched that scene, I was like, oh, okay, that's not that bad. She agrees, she's consenting to going on a date, but after he pushes it. And I think we see this a lot in romantic comedies where we see this chase, and it's disguised with humor and flirtiness. And I think this inherently just perpetuates unhealthy relationships, and you can't take no for an answer. And again, this is also very in a heteronormative way. But I really think that scene, and we see it a lot in romantic comedies, just really uplifting that gender norm of this relationship and chasing someone to get a relationship. And I even missed it, and I do this work, so I just thought that was really interesting.
And I have one line that he says in there
Yeah.
that was really interesting. I was the same way. Love Bo Burnham. So it was hard. I was like, oh man. And I rewatched it because I wanted to rewatch kind of certain parts of it. He says to Cassie, go to lunch with me.
Yeah, he doesn't even ask.
Not even ask. It just says, go to lunch with me. And then at the end of the movie, when he wants forgiveness, he not asks for forgiveness, tells her it's time.
Mm-hmm.
You have to forgive me. Not just hey, do you forgive me? Would you like to go to lunch? No. Go to lunch with me. forgive me.
Yeah.
And it's just those little subtle things. Also with romantic comedies, like a lot of times the premise is that a woman sets boundaries and is like, hey, let's stop talking, you messed up. The guy's like, don't worry, I'll embarrass you in front of everyone. And she's like, oh, you didn't forget about me, that's so wonderful, credits. So I think with that, and like, even like we were talking about the movie She's All That, where it's like, we don't notice. It's like we don't notice the main character. I mean, she's into art. We do. And then all of a sudden, it's like she looks a certain way. It's like, wow, God, have you seen? Let's go to prom together. And there are so many things within romantic comedies that if it came with a serious tone, it would be really disturbing. Yeah. So I completely agree.
And even like with those gender norms, like when Cassie goes out and she has to like kind of like dress up, and there's another scene in the film where she's like doing her makeup and she's watching I'm not gonna be explicit here, but she's like watching a video of someone doing their makeup, and it's like really like sexualized, and I just find that really interesting that she would, you know, kind of do this makeup and dress in a certain way that's like, but that then is attractive to the men who are like in the bars with her and somehow makes her like more of a target. And we see this in the movie, in multiple movies, and how that just like really like over sexualizing of like women, and then in turn using it as like shame and blame for if something happens to them, which is really harmful and like it just perpetuates the violence even further.
This is not about romantic comedies in general, because I don't actually like romantic comedies, so I've seen very, very few. But in this film, I think one, gender trope, I guess it's not a gender norm as the question asked, but like one trope that I saw again and again that really got to me was this like idea of the crazy woman. We hear so many times, oh, you're crazy, or this girl's a psycho. I think Jerry says that, right? Or someone says that Jerry told him Cassie's a psycho. And she's not. She's suffering from trauma. She's grieving. She's coping really poorly, but she's not crazy. And I think that in the few romantic comedies I've seen, there can be this like romanticization of like kind of the crazy quirky girl. And mental illness isn't that funny. Speaking as someone who's experienced it, it's not hilarious. I also, what Amanda said about the coffee shop thing. If a man spit in my coffee, I would be terrified. I would be I don't drink coffee, but I would be terrified. I would think there's something wrong with this person, and I feel deeply uncomfortable. He takes it as like a quirky, cute, flirty gesture. It is objectively not. Yeah, and he drinks it. And he drinks it. So yes, I like 100% echo what you're saying. That was such a weird scene for me that rung as like, oh my gosh, that would be terrifying if a man like looked me straight in the eye, spit in my coffee. I would think he was a serial killer, and I would fear for my life. Like funny, but also like, I mean, these are things that, I have to worry about, or other people who maybe identify as women or present in a femme way have to worry about that Bo Burnham didn't. So there's lots to say about gender in this film.
Mental health is a huge theme in this movie, but the term is never explicitly mentioned at all. What is the significance of this? How is it relevant to what is going on with the characters in this film? How does the impact of trauma manifest itself differently throughout the film?
Kick us off? I'm not going to speak on it. I spoke a lot, so.
Yeah, there is just so much here. I want to start with the fact that there's no therapist in this film. Right? Where is the therapist? Give me a quirky therapist that likes art, please. Someone. Right? Like, we also never get any mention of anxiety, of depression, of trauma. We don't get any line ever at any point of someone saying Nina died by suicide. Why? right? It speaks to this huge, larger issue surrounding the stigma in mental health, right? That when we're grieving, we think we just have to like muscle through, right? This all happens. You just gotta get over it. And you know, where mental health could be normalized, we might see each other differently, right? We might express things differently to each other. Like Nina's mom, right? When she's talking to Cassie, and Cassie is clearly grieving in so many ways, right? And of course, Nina's family is too, but she says, you can't come inside and we can't keep doing this and you need to get over it, right? I think so much about this, right? There's so much in there to unpack. One of the big things that comes up for me is that sometimes when people are grieving the same loss, they can't support each other in it. And that has to be okay, right? But when we don't have nuanced ways to say that, it comes out really harsh, right? So if Nina's mom had said, I'm having a really hard time with this and I can't support you through it, but here's someone who can, right? Different movie, different movie, right? Cassie's parents have no idea what to do. They have no idea what to do. Her mom says, what do I tell my friends? Right? Cassie's like, that is literally the last thing I need to hear. Please, can we not talk about how I dropped out of college, because I am in no way prepared for this. Right? People just don't know what to do when someone is struggling, what to say. And I think they do such a good job in the movie, very eloquently doing that, right? No one knows what to do. I want to talk about Cassie. Cassie is someone who has experienced the loss of her best friend and is seeking vengeance, right, to try to make the pain of it mean something, right? It has to mean something because I don't know what to do with this. And as I was thinking about, you know, the behavior when she's going into bars, pretending she's drunk, you know, going home with men. At first I was like, I've seen, you know, so many of these like women getting back at the bad guy type movies, right? But we don't get a scene where Cassie's taking a self-defense class. We don't get a scene where she's like tucking a knife into a boot, right? And I'm like, why don't we get that? And it suddenly became clear that Cassie was always going to die in the end, right? Cassie at this point in her life is struggling so hard with her mental health, with her grief, with the loss, with her own trauma, that she doesn't care whether or not she lives or dies. So all of those scenes show passive suicidal ideation, all of them, right? And Cassie is in this terrifying cycle of risky behavior, where I think we didn't even realize that Emerald, Fennell, talks about that behavior as self-harm, right? I didn't even think about it like that. But it's an addicting cycle that she's in, and she doesn't see a way out. There's just so much there. Do you want to talk about trauma now?
No, I'm gonna let Jordan go first, but I probably will have to.
Oh no, I don't have too much to add out. I think the mental health component of this, when something is happening but no one puts a word to it or defines it, it's hard to then get help. And I think that's when you hear a lot of people are diagnosed with a mental health disorder. For some people, there's a moment of relief because it's an answer, but also there can be help on the other side of it. And when I think about what Cassie is going through, I think it spoke to who is allowed to grieve, in what way, and for how long. And to me, that's what this film speaks so much to. It's like everyone is telling Cassie, you have to get over it. You have to grow up. You have to move on. I can't do anything. It's out of our control. And throughout this, no one says to Cassie, like, there's space here for you to grieve. Like, just, here's a card, here's a therapist. There's like nothing in there where here is some space for you to just be and to come back to that identity. Because if you look throughout the movie, it's a different identity throughout, especially with all the situations that she's putting herself in. But there's never just that relief, that constant relief moment. It's always just brief in the moment. And so I think so much of that is missing too within this film of talking about grieving and allowing time and space for that to happen. And that's also a part I felt was missing throughout this entire movie.
I love talking about trauma. I am also a social worker. My certification is in trauma work, and I think that this movie is like a classic example of trauma that's misunderstood. Trauma deeply impacts all of our systems, and sometimes the behavior that people who are experiencing trauma exhibit is unexpected. It doesn't make sense to us, but that's because trauma literally messes with our brain chemistry, right? It doesn't make sense. So some of the behaviors, for example, that I used, I guess, following my assault in college probably didn't make sense to a lot of the people around me. I started drinking a lot. That's kind of what I consider like the origin story of my alcoholism. Which didn't make sense really because I had been assaulted while intoxicated. But trauma responses don't always make sense. And I think, Cassie's an example of someone who's experienced secondary trauma in a real way, and she's not coping with it well. I think that, I want to be mindful of time. I could talk about trauma for hours, but I just think, yes, this is kind of, these behaviors we see as being like, oh yeah, like, get it, girl, go avenge the death of your best friend. It's like, as Caitlin and Jordan have both said, these are coming from a place of deep hurt, and these are trauma responses. This is not something we should be cheering on and normalizing. We should be normalizing getting help for these behaviors because, they're born out of trauma. And I wish there had been a therapist in there as well. That would have been great.
What message does it send to society as a whole, and what messages are we internalizing when we hear some of the reviews, reactions, and critiques about the film, Promising Young Woman?
So when you search Promising Young Woman, in Google and, reviews come up, I really think it's important, and this is why the conversation around media literacy really needs to happen. Because when you search the film, you'll immediately go to two things. That's probably one was a review from, and I'm blanking on his name, from Variety. And then the other one is all the critiques about the review from Variety, right? And so the reviews, from the media are not this conversation. They're not unpacking these things much at all. And the review for Variety was all about what Carey Mulligan looked like and how it would have been so much better if, what is her name?
Margot
Robbie.
If she had played her instead, because that's who this person sees more as Cassie, right? And what ends up happening a lot of times is that those articles become then somebody else's words and thoughts, right? And that's what the story becomes. And that's why it's so dangerous sometimes, and then people say, well, they're saying that, it shouldn't have been Carey Mulligan, it should have been Margot Robbie. And they're saying she really didn't do a really good job. She didn't really look the part she was supposed to look. And again, it was all boiled down to the expression, the looks, and not these other issues. And then people started saying, well, is it okay that this person from Variety had this opinion? And what's it about journalism, right? And we missed such an opportunity. That person has since apologized to Carey Mulligan, but I really think it's important, we are what we consume. We are what we consume, particularly from the media. So I think it's, when you read something, say like, consider the source. Who is writing this? What are some of the other articles that they write about? Why do they have this lens? Is critical, rather than their words somehow speak to you and then become your words, I think is really important.
Great lead into this question. What messages are we internalizing as a society when we witness the war between femininity and feminism, when we hear critiques about a woman's appearance, while the conversation is about equal rights or a systemic issue? Do we see this displayed in the film?
So, I think about, I spend a lot of time talking with people, who talk about feminism and the different waves of feminism that have happened over the years. And so it's interesting now, because sometimes I'll say, are we in the third wave of feminism, or is it just not relevant anymore, right? Because, we're in such a gender fluid, non-binary society. But I think that, if we look back in history, right, feminism, the first wave really starts about, I'm a woman and I'm not somebody else's property, right? Like that's the turn of the century and at the end of the 19th century, and the second wave of feminism comes about more around the civil rights era, right? Roe versus Wade, the different things, Title IX, 1972, those pieces about giving equal rights and trying to abolish gender discrimination, but also at a time that's saying we reject feminine roles, and feminine, right, and femininity somehow becomes confounded also with feminism, right? And so I think sometimes that has played into it, and then we have this kind of third wave in the 1990s to say, like, I reject all of that, and I'm gonna dress however I want, and I'm gonna do whatever I want, and somehow, again, femininity is called into question. I think we have to separate that. I think it's really important that people can absolutely, and I think I really loved what you said before. It's like when you're watching something and somebody's in a pencil skirt and shoes and things like that. I was like, what are you trying to say to me? Right, but the message gets lost, that when somebody's trying to talk about women's rights, equal rights, equal pay, being able to express yourself freely, and so often it leads into, well, why would she wear her hair like that if she wants to? And I'm like, oh my God. Somehow that's comfortable, right? We kind of revert back to that place. So I don't know if I'm making sense at all, but these are some of the things I think about as the two are intertwined.
Yes. Anyone else? Can we talk about the difference between holding someone accountable for a crime they've committed versus the concept of, quote, cancel culture? How is this displayed in the film?
Lisa? What, me? No, really? Is that good?
I'm sorry, they're all back to that.
So we think, accountability and blame are two very different things, right? We know this, accountability and blame. And I think sometimes it's this idea of accountability. It's like, this person did this, punish them, right? There's no other way than somebody else telling them what they did was wrong and what should happen to them, right? And accountability isn't that, right? It's a conversation. And the question, which I ask, so I'll share with you when I'm speaking to somebody and somebody says, well, how are you gonna hold them accountable? The question is not what do you think a punishment should be, right? It's how do you repair the harm, right? And to give space to that conversation is so important, right? Because when it's more than just saying somebody did X, so Y should happen. It's something here, X happened, how do we remedy the effects of it? How do we end the harm, and how do we prevent its recurrence, right? How do we repair what's happened? And I think cancel culture has become more along the lines of blame, where it's to say, I'm gonna put distance to this, and I'm going to say, okay, I'm blaming that person, and I'm just gonna cut off everything because it's sometimes easier to do that. But when we cancel somebody and we put something in an arm's length and saying, I'm not gonna go there anymore, all it does for me, I think, is sometimes it stops a conversation, it breeds more anger, nothing is learned from it. When you hold somebody accountable, as, I don't know if anybody here is a fan of Brene Brown, she says like,
For Brene.
yes, right? Brene Brown says when accountability is really about, it really fosters compassion, right? And I think that is so much, where I see what's needed.
Can I add to that?
Please add.
Like,
I'm talking.
as you were talking, I was thinking about Brene Brown, and she's a shame researcher, if like folks aren't aware, and she's great. And on a smaller scale, that's like when someone's not committing a crime, and you're having conversations with like your friends and your loved ones, and say someone makes a victim blaming remark, like, well, she asked for it, for example. I've done this in my past, and I revert to shaming and blaming them and getting angry at them, and that is so valid. But it closes the conversation, and there's no room for educating that other person. And of course, people have to be open to being educated as well. But I think, I've changed that reaction in my own life. If someone says that, like, I try to, I'm like, oh, I understand why you would say that given our society. Like, that is something that has been perpetuated as a norm to say. And then offer other examples of what to say that is correct. And I've seen the room for, growing in the other individual and the room to open the conversation up when, that shame and blame is removed, while holding them accountable at the same time. Like, that isn't okay to say. And it's really empowering when you can switch that in the conversations that you have.
Anyone else? So Emerald Fennell said, quote, it's an act of self-harm revenge. What she's doing is addictive. It's self-harm. It's at best briefly a relief. We discussed addictive cycles. We need the need for release. For some people, it's drinking, drugs, or gambling. Her thing is this thing. It's going, it's waiting, it's punishing, and it's incredibly dangerous. End quote. In what way are we changing anything by having this discussion? In what way did Cassie change anything by confronting the men she met at the bar when they are confronted with her sobriety?
So I'll speak to that second part because when I was talking with Caitlin about this, whenever in the very first scene, whenever Cassie wakes up and says, "What are you doing?" Like within that first scene, there's this like look of shock of like, and I was trying to figure out what that is. Like, what does that represent? Does that represent, oh no? Does that represent accountability? What does that represent? And I thought of it as in those two scenes when Cassie finally says, "What are you doing?" I thought of it as almost like when you're going to take a picture, but it's in selfie mode, and you're just not ready to see what you look like in that moment, especially from this angle. And so it's not just what you look like, but I wasn't prepared for that. And I think that with so many of the characters in this movie, Cassie's holding up a mirror and says, I need you to think about some of the things we've discussed, talking about with Alison Brie in that character, with talking about the dean. It's holding up a mirror through conversation. But with those two instances, it's just immediate, is this who I am? And that type of conversation can be, I'm sure, difficult for some, but necessary. And I think that's the point of this film. And I heard Emerald Fennell, she was doing an interview, and she asked someone that she went to college with, what did you think? And his response was, I felt like you were watching all of us. All the men on campus, I thought like you were watching our every move, and that's what this movie's about. And that speaks a lot to being able to not necessarily have that selfie mode moment, but that in the mirror moment. And it speaks kind of to what we opened with, was I don't know a ton of people who watch this movie But the people who did watch this movie, I have hours upon hours of conversations about, and that's what I hope to continue with this film.
Anyone else? Oh no, sorry. When I think of this movie, I can't help but think of the Me Too movement. What are some of the challenges this movement has faced, and what progress has it made?
With the Me Too movement, I think, again, going back to thinking as a Black man, there are certain parallels that I feel with Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement in terms of the way that it started, the way that it's discussed, and the way that it's been delegitimized by other people who are trying to just not have the conversation. And one word that they use is all. So for Black Lives Matter, simple Black Lives Matter, that's it. But then it's, oh, you mean all lives matter? It's like, well, yeah, no, that's obvious. I'm saying Black Lives Matter, and then all lives matter becomes a rebuttal. Because we can't say, no, they don't. That'd be, that's harsh. That's a little on the nose. But if I say all lives matter, then we don't have to have the conversation, and I don't have to hear you talk about Black lives. Going back to the Me Too movement, believe women. Very simple, to the point. You mean believe all women? It's like, no, that's not what I said. So you're telling me, whenever someone starts with you're telling me, it's never a good sign. So you're telling me believe all women, any woman, and all the time. And I think that within this, we do hear the moments like when someone says they got Me Too. And that because something that's normalized. So like trying to, again, invalidate what this cause truly is. And to me, I think that also speaks to the power of what this is. Part of the reason why people want to silence Black Lives Matter is because there are voices out there that are being heard. Part of the Me Too movement. The fact that people want to say, you mean believe all women, as in to not only protect men, but also to say that these women don't have a voice. That couldn't be further from the truth. And I think that's, to me, where this parallel happens, where it is a movement that, of course, all movements aren't perfect. I remember Roxane Gay started with Bad Feminists, and she said that all causes that are started by humans are flawed, because humans are inherently flawed. And I think that with any cause, there's always going to be room for improvement and for growth. And thanks to people using their voices in the way that they are, I hope that continues with the Me Too movement.
Gosh, that was beautiful. Yeah, I guess I'll just talk about what Me Too was for me. I think first found out about Me Too on social media. One day, my feed starts just like trickling in with all these posts of my friends who are cataloging all of the range, right, of different types of sexual assault, from like sexual harassment all the way up to rape. And hey. Yeah, it was kind of like that, but like over and over and over again. Just like all of these people that I knew and knew personally. And I am someone who is a social worker, right? I do this stuff, right? I am someone who is absolutely holding safe space for everyone in my life. And yet so many of my close friends were now posting online for the world to see about the things that they in no way could talk about before, right? And the things that they were saying, right, suddenly made me say to myself, well, if that is sexual assault, what about this time in my life, right? Does that count? And like, if this counts, then like, what about this? And, well, I was drunk, so that doesn't, oh wait, maybe it does count. Right? And so suddenly, by hearing the experiences of other people, I'm able to look at my own and redefine them. Right? The things that I was sitting in shame with suddenly have room to breathe. Right? Have room to be a part of something greater. Right? So I think a lot of us experience sexism or sexual assault, and it just sort of sits, right? It just sort of sits and we feel shame about it. And it's like this little fire inside of you, right? That like you try your hardest to ignore. The thing about that is it always burns you first, right? And so suddenly Me Too happened, and every woman that I know is bearing flames for the entire world to see. And we were wildfire, right? Like we just all caught at the same moment. And it was like the most unifying experience to know that literally every woman in my life has experienced this, and I no longer have to hold it alone, right? It is, we are all bearing the weight of it. And for me, like that is massive. That is a massive shift in the narrative that I hold about myself, and the narrative that I hold about the women in my life and about the world, right? Pain is so much easier to manage when it is shared. And I think that's what Me Too did. I think that that's what conversations like this do, right? When we take all of our collective experiences and hold them together, they don't feel so heavy anymore. And suddenly we can see them in a different way and look in a different way and say, oh, I didn't realize that was patriarchy this whole time. Did anyone else realize that? Right? And so we can see the problem in a different way and react to it in a different way. And I think it's just tremendous, right? It's like a full circle moment. Where here we are talking about this, and I don't know if Me Too hadn't happened, if we'd be having this conversation, or at least in the same way. So it can get really, really difficult when you think about all these things that happen, all the cases. But I think you have to celebrate some wins. And if I see hope, if I'm asking myself, like, where is the hope in this, like, ever massive monster of patriarchy and misogyny and, like, all of it, right? It is in the collective shared experience that we are all stronger together.
Beautiful. Anyone else? That was perfect. In situations such as what we have discussed here tonight, where and how does healing happen?
That's room.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, Elizabeth, you mentioned this about trauma not just impacting the person that it happened to, but like loved ones and then the community at large. And I have this quote from a mentor of mine who had written a blog. She's amazing. She works at Reach Beyond Domestic Violence. And I had it written in my notes last year, and I stumbled upon it recently, and it's something that has stuck with me, so I just kind of wanted to read it all to you because I think it's just perfect. I remind myself that what I can offer has so much more to do with how I hold the space rather than how I fill it. I can promote healing in others when I embody it myself. Healing has a lot less to do with the armor that we wear and a lot more to do with the strength of our vulnerability beneath it. And I just think that's this entire conversation in general.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think when we're having these kinds of conversations, there has to be healing on two levels. And I guess that quote kind of speaks to that, you know, the internal healing that has to happen, the work that we saw Cassie didn't do, unfortunately. Maybe wasn't accessible to her. She wasn't aware that it was an option, but that internal work is so important, the internal healing. But as we just heard from Caitlin, as we've heard from everyone on the panel tonight, you know, the healing also has to happen on a collective level. And I think that one can't be privileged over another. I think both kinds of healing have to happen simultaneously, especially for people who do identify as victims/survivors, which, as we've heard, is so many people, too many people. So I guess I would also say that, that for the work to happen internally is really important, and for it to happen externally, collectively, is equally as important. And we didn't really see either of those things happening in the film significantly. So I'm glad we got to chat about that tonight.
Before we say goodbye, is there anything you'd like to tell people? What is your hope moving forward? What do you want people to take away from this movie or conversation?
I would just, invite people to have these conversations in their own lives. Again, what you said, Elizabeth, just now, in order for healing to happen, in order for, violence and sexual violence to stop, having these conversations in our inner circles are really crucial. And, if you're somewhere with someone and like something happens to them, or you see something starting to happen to them, like say something, I think, being an active bystander is really crucial. And, it's when we're all together and like working together to end this, I think, that's the goal. That's what we want. That's why we're all sitting here. And always believe survivors. I think that's the biggest thing out of this as well, no matter who they are.
That's what I say as well. Like I said before, believe, and then too, just to keep talking and having conversations like this. And then so often people say to me, sometimes I just don't know what to say. And I think that that's okay. And sometimes when you don't know what to say, it's not really probably time for you to talk then, right? Maybe ask a question, or maybe just say, tell me more about that. Or, I appreciate you sharing this with me. Like, what would be helpful in this moment? I think sometimes it's like, well, I don't have the answer. It's like, maybe you're not being asked the answer. You just time to listen and ask some more questions.
Final thoughts?
Should we all take a deep breath?
Can I say one last thing?
Of course.
Recently I was traveling from Arizona back to Philadelphia, and it's about a 5-hour flight. So like all people, I just who would do. I watched the Anita Hill testimony. It was 4 hours on YouTube.
Why did you do that to yourself?
I did, but I was watching in preparation for this because it's just there's so much of that conversation that was started by Anita Hill back in 1991. And she said something in there that I think about today as I'm sitting here as a cisgender, male, being able to be in this space and being able to listen because one of the things I recently heard is it's not just about listening to someone in a conversation, listen to other women have these conversations. That's where you're really going to learn. One of the things Anita Hill said was, these aren't mere allegations, these are my truths. And so I'm just fortunate, I'm very happy, I'm very grateful to be a part of this conversation. I just want to say thank you.
Well, this has just been an incredible evening and conversation. I'm just so grateful that you are all here for it. Elizabeth, Jordan, Caitlin, Amanda, Lisa. Thank you for being so vulnerable and open and sharing everything that you shared. Just thanks. I could listen to you all talk for days.
Thank you.